The air inside Murphy's Bar and Grill was thick with the smell of grilled burgers, stale beer, and ocean salt drifting in from the boardwalk. It was the kind of place where locals came to drink, laugh, and talk about the day. A place where everyone knew each other, and trouble was usually left at the door. James Jim Lawson, a 68-year-old retired Marine Corps veteran, sat at the far end of the bar, sipping a whiskey neat. He wasn't here for conversation. He liked the quiet, the routine of it all. The bartender, Ray, a guy in his 40s who had been running the place for years, knew better than to ask Jim too many questions. The man came in, drank his whiskey, watched the game on the muted TV above the bar, and went home. But tonight, that peace was about to be broken. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. The door slammed open, letting in a gust of salty air, the laughter of passing tourists, and the unmistakable stumbling, slurred voice of a man who had already had too much to drink. Trevor Hawkins, a wealthy, entitled tourist, staggered inside, his white linen shirt half unbuttoned, his designer watch flashing under the dim lights. He was the kind of man who thought money gave him power, the kind who had never worked a real day in his life, but liked to act like he had seen it all. Behind him, two of his equally drunk friends followed, chuckling as Trevor loudly declared his presence. "Man, these small-town bars have so much character," Trevor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Bet we'll meet some real salt-of-the-earth types here." Jim didn't even look up. Trevor scanned the room, his cloudy eyes locking onto the quiet, weathered man at the bar. Something about Jim's calm presence irritated him. Maybe it was the way the old man didn't react, didn't acknowledge him like he was someone important. Trevor nudged one of his friends. "Look at this guy," he muttered loudly, pointing at Jim, sitting there like he's some kind of war hero. His friend chuckled nervously. "Dude, maybe just let it go." But Trevor was already walking over. Jim still didn't move as Trevor plopped down onto the stool beside him, too close, too loud. "You ever do anything real, old man?" Trevor slurred, waving for the bartender. "Or do you just sit here, trying to make people feel bad for you?" Ray's jaw tightened, but Jim took another sip of his whiskey. That only pissed Trevor off more. "Come on," Trevor goaded, nudging Jim's arm. "Bet you tell people stories to get free drinks, huh?" Jim finally set his glass down, slow and controlled, his fingers tapping once against the bar. He didn't turn, didn't even look at Trevor. Trevor smirked. He took that as a sign to push further. "You know, I don't get the whole respect the veterans thing," Trevor continued, waving his drink sloppily. "You guys just shoot guns and expect us to bow down, huh? Bet you haven't been in a real fight in decades." Jim's grip on his whiskey glass tightened, but his expression remained unreadable. Trevor, emboldened by the lack of reaction, reached for the faded Marine Corps cap sitting beside Jim's drink. "Bet this thing's older than I am," Trevor scoffed, twirling it between his fingers. The bar went dead silent. Even the music playing softly in the background didn't seem loud enough to break the tension. Jim finally moved, not fast, not aggressive, just precise. He took the cap from Trevor's hands without a word, dusted it off, and set it neatly back on the bar. Then he turned his head slightly, not enough to face Trevor fully, but just enough that when he spoke, his voice cut through the room like steel. "Put your drink down, son," Jim said, his voice dangerously calm, "and walk away." Trevor blinked, caught off guard. His smirk faltered for half a second before he forced out a laugh. "Oh, come on, old man. You're not..." Jim turned fully now, and for the first time, Trevor saw it. The weight in his eyes, not anger, not fear, just the look of a man who had already seen things Trevor could never imagine. And suddenly, for the first time that night, Trevor hesitated. But now, it was too late. Trevor smirked, but there was a nervous twitch in his lips now. His drunken bravado told him to keep pushing, but something deeper, something instinctual, was whispering back off. He ignored it. "Walk away?" Trevor laughed, forcing confidence into his voice. "Or what, old man? You gonna teach me a lesson? Give me some grand speech about how hard your life was?" Jim didn't answer right away. He just stared. Trevor could handle fights, insults, even threats. But this quiet, deliberate stare was something else. The weight of it pulled at him, the way a man might feel when he stands too close to the edge of a cliff and realizes how small he truly is. The bar was still silent. Ray, the bartender, had taken a step back. The regulars watched without speaking. Even Trevor's own friends had retreated into their seats, their amusement long gone. Jim tapped his fingers on the bar, slow, controlled. "You ever been in a fight, son?" Trevor scoffed. "Please?" He rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the tension creeping into his spine. "Yeah, I've been in plenty of fights." Jim nodded slowly. "Ever fought someone who wasn't just throwing drunk punches? Someone who actually knew what they were doing?" Trevor didn't answer right away. He didn't like the way that question sat in his chest. Jim picked up his whiskey, took another sip, and exhaled as he set it down. "No, I didn't think so." Trevor felt something bubbling inside him, a mix of embarrassment, anger, and something else. Something he didn't want to name. He had never been the guy to back down, not to some old man. He gritted his teeth, stepping forward again, shoving his chest out. "You think just because you fought in a war, you're better than me?" Jim sighed, shaking his head. "No, son. I think you've never met a man who's actually dangerous before." Trevor scoffed, but the weight in his chest grew heavier. Jim turned slightly in his stool, fully facing him now. And that's when Trevor finally noticed just how broad the old man was. His shoulders weren't hunched like an old man's. His posture wasn't stiff like someone weighed down by time. Jim moved like a man who had trained his body for survival and never forgot how to use it. Trevor's fingers twitched at his sides, his mouth dry. Jim tilted his head slightly. "You ever hear the name Briggs?" Trevor blinked. "What?" "Briggs, first sergeant. Led recon operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, ran deep patrols, survived more firefights than he could count." Jim's voice didn't change, didn't waver. "That's me, son." Trevor swallowed. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Jim leaned forward slightly, just enough to make Trevor feel like the room had gotten smaller. "You ever had a man look you in the eyes?" Jim said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "And know, without a doubt, that he could end you in 3 seconds?" Trevor tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. Jim smirked. "You're feeling it now, aren't you?" Trevor's heart pounded against his ribs, because he was feeling it. His body was recognizing something his drunk mind refused to accept. The man in front of him wasn't some old vet with war stories. He was a predator who had been waiting for something worth hunting, and Trevor had just painted himself as prey. Jim didn't move. He didn't need to. Trevor took a half step back. Jim nodded, satisfied. "That's what I thought?" Trevor hated how that sounded, hated that he had let this man rattle him. But he couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. This wasn't just another bar confrontation. This was a warning, one Trevor would be a damn fool to ignore. Trevor's face burned, a mix of alcohol, humiliation, and something else, something primal he didn't want to admit. Fear. He had never been afraid of an old man before, but Jim Briggs wasn't just any old man. He was different. The way he spoke, the way he moved, the way he looked at him. It was like staring at a coiled rattlesnake, one that didn't need to rattle to prove it could kill. Trevor swallowed hard, forcing himself to regain control. He couldn't just back down in front of the entire bar. His ego wouldn't let him. He needed to do something, say something, turn the tide back in his favor. "Whatever, man," Trevor scoffed, forcing a smirk. "You're just some washed-up vet trying to act tough. I bet all you do now is sit in this dump, waiting for someone to give you a reason to talk about your glory days." Jim didn't flinch. He just studied Trevor, calm, patient, like he was waiting for something. Trevor took a step forward, shoving his hands into his pockets, trying to mask the shaking in his fingers. "You think you scare me?" Jim smirked. "Son, I don't think. I know." That single sentence sent a cold wave through Trevor's spine. His instinct screamed at him to stop, to walk away. But his pride, his stupid, overinflated pride, kept pushing him forward. "You know what?" Trevor said, his voice louder, trying to play for the audience now. "You act like some kind of badass, but you're just another old guy living off war stories. What, you think you could still take a guy like me?" The bar had gone completely silent. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here. And before we continue with the story, please Please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Jim exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Son, I could end this in less time than it takes for you to order another drink. Trevor barked out a laugh, too loud, too forced. Yeah? You gonna prove it? Jim leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the bar, his expression shifting into something unreadable. No, son, because if I proved it, you'd be leaving this place in an ambulance, and I'm too damn old to be filling out police reports tonight. Trevor's stomach dropped. Jim wasn't posturing, he wasn't bluffing, he was simply stating a fact, and everyone in the room knew it. A bead of sweat rolled down Trevor's temple. His confidence had evaporated, his smirk was gone, and now, for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be outmatched. Jim didn't need to fight him. He had already won. Trevor licked his lips, desperate to save face. He turned to his friends, expecting them to jump in, back him up, laugh along. But when he looked at them, he saw something he hadn't expected. Discomfort. They weren't laughing. They weren't on his side anymore. One of them, a shorter guy with slicked back hair, looked away, embarrassed. The other just muttered, "Dude, maybe let it go." Let it go. Trevor clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of his own failure. He had walked in here thinking he was the biggest man in the room, and now he had never felt smaller. Jim sighed, picking up his whiskey, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. He didn't even look at Trevor anymore. Trevor had become irrelevant, and that stung more than anything. Trevor exhaled sharply, stepping back. Whatever, this place is a joke anyway. His voice wasn't nearly as steady as before. He turned on his heel, his movements stiff, clumsy. He hated this feeling, the feeling of retreating, of being dismissed, of losing. As he reached the door, Jim finally spoke again, his voice calm, almost amused. "Don't let me catch you disrespecting another veteran again." Trevor froze, his pulse spiked. He didn't turn around, he just nodded once and walked out the door. The second he was gone, the bar let out a breath. Conversation started back up, the tension fading. People returned to their drinks, their meals, but there was a new respect in the air for Jim Briggs. Ray, the bartender, smirked, sliding another whiskey in front of Jim. "On the house?" Jim chuckled. "Didn't even have to touch him." Ray shook his head. "Didn't need to?" A few regulars laughed, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. Jim picked up his Marine Corps cap, placed it back on his head, adjusting it just right. Then, as if nothing had happened, he took another sip of his whiskey. Because real men don't need to prove their strength, they already have. And Trevor? He had just learned the most painful lesson of his life. Trevor walked fast, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement outside the bar. His face burned, but not from the alcohol. It was humiliation, pure and raw. The moment he had stepped out of that bar, he had felt it, the weight of his own failure. He had always been the guy who had the last word, the one who laughed the loudest, who won. But tonight, he had walked into Murphy's bar like he owned the place, and now he was leaving with his tail tucked between his legs. The worst part? No one had even touched him. Jim Briggs hadn't lifted a single finger. He hadn't needed to. Trevor reached the parking lot, his heart pounding. He turned the corner and stopped, leaning against the side of his rental car. His hands were still shaking, though he tried to tell himself it was just the alcohol wearing off. But he knew the truth. It was that stare, that unshaken, unbothered, steel-eyed stare that had locked onto him and stripped away every ounce of bravado he had. He clenched his fists, staring at his reflection in the car window. The man staring back at him didn't look like the confident, untouchable guy he thought he was. He looked weak. A soft laugh made him tense. Trevor turned to see one of his friends, Jason, standing nearby with his hands in his pockets. The guy had followed him out of the bar, but hadn't said a word until now. "You know," Jason said, shaking his head, "I don't think I've ever seen you lose a fight before." Trevor scoffed, forcing a smirk. "I didn't lose. I just..." Jason raised an eyebrow. "You just what?" Trevor had no answer. He just let out a frustrated breath and ran a hand through his hair. "Whatever, man. That guy was just trying to intimidate me. He's nothing." Jason chuckled, but it wasn't the usual, Let's laugh at the dumb, tourist kind of chuckle. It was something different, something almost pitying. "You don't get it, do you?" Jason said, stepping closer. "That guy wasn't trying to intimidate you. He was warning you." Trevor frowned. "Warning me about what?" Jason sighed. "That there are real men out there, Trevor, and you're not one of them." Trevor stiffened. "Screw you, man." Jason held up his hands. "I'm serious. You talk big, you push people around, but the second you ran into someone who's actually been through something, who's actually fought for something bigger than himself, you crumbled. We all saw it." Trevor turned away, his jaw tight. Jason exhaled sharply. "You know, I looked that guy up while you were making an idiot of yourself in there." He pulled out his phone, scrolling. James Jim Briggs, Marine Recon, served 20 years, survived more firefights than most soldiers see in a lifetime, got a silver star, 2 bronze stars, and a Purple Heart. That guy's a legend. Trevor didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to know, but the words settled in his gut like a lead weight. A legend. And he had walked into that bar thinking he was the biggest man in the room. Trevor let out a short, bitter laugh. "So what? You think I should have just, bowed down to him?" Jason shook his head. "Number, I think you should have respected him. I think you should have shut the hell up and listened to a man who's actually been through something real." Trevor clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. Jason shrugged. "But you didn't. And now you're out here, trying to pretend it didn't happen." Trevor didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the ground. Jason sighed and patted him on the shoulder. "Take the loss, man, and maybe next time, don't open your mouth when you don't know who you're talking to." With that, Jason walked back toward the bar, leaving Trevor alone with his thoughts. Trevor stayed there for a long time, standing in the cool night air, staring at the pavement. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about what it meant to be a man, and he knew he had a long way to go. Inside the bar, Jim Briggs took another slow sip of his whiskey, unfazed, unshaken, exactly as he had been from the start. Because some men don't need to prove their strength, they already have. And tonight, Trevor Hawkins had just learned a lesson he would never forget. The end.